Fire Away tackles burning questions and hot topics in Canadian employment law, human resources, and dispute resolution. Hosted by Rudner Law, Fire Away is your go-to source for legal insight on the world of work. So whether you are an employee or an employer, a lawyer or an HR pro, let's ignite the conversation and get into today's episode. Here's your host, employment lawyer, mediator, and founder of Rudner Law, Stuart Rudner.
Welcome to Season 7, Episode 12 of Fire Away. It's our first episode of 2025, but the last episode of this season. So lots going on in the world this week. And one thing you may have noticed recently is that headlines are suggesting that a number of U.S. companies are pulling back on their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and practices. And headlines are suggesting that, among other companies, McDonald's is ending several of its DEI initiatives, including goals that are meant to diversify its leadership and its suppliers. They're going to pause some of their surveys on diversity efforts. We've also seen headlines referring to Walmart, Toyota, and a rash of other companies suggesting that they are scaling back or withdrawing from their DEI initiatives. So it's a great time to talk about DEI, diversity, and hiring. And I'm very excited today to be joined by Pam McElvane, who's the CEO and founder of the P&L Group and author of the recently published book, The Skinny on Diversity Recruiting, which I understand will be a series of quote-unquote skinny books, which I look forward to reading the rest of. But that book is described as a must-read step-by-step guide for businesses of any size to develop and hone their recruiting strategies from start to finish. So Pam, welcome to the show and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I think it's going to be a great discussion. And as we were talking about in the green room before, I mean, DEI can be a somewhat contentious topic, and there's often a lot of misconceptions, misunderstandings. It gets a lot of support, but there's also a lot of backlash and criticism and confusion. So I'm anxious to hear your views. And I'm also very excited to be joined by our second guest, Rakesh Tiku. Rakesh is someone I know through a local business group, and we have had discussions about issues like DEI. And Rakesh is the CEO of Infield Solutions, and their mission is to empower their clients to prioritize what truly matters and achieve their growth by leveraging technology. But the main reason I want Rakesh on this discussion is because I've been involved in these discussions, and he will provide us with how can I put it? The perspective of a business leader, and he's not shy to respectfully challenge some of the things that people take for granted and ask questions. So I think it should lead to a really good discussion. So Rakesh, thanks for joining us as well.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and thank you for this forum.
Now, as I said, I think it's going to be a great discussion. And Pam, I guess I'll start with a question for you. And I took a number of quotes either from your book or from reviews of your book. And the first one was that this book dispels common misconceptions surrounding diversity recruitment. So I'd love to start off by talking about what some of those common misconceptions are.
Particularly US-based, where most of our research is 70% of frontline recruiters are white Americans. And within that, 62% of them are white women. So one of the I think the key things to understand is we do have, I guess a large force of women, white women with a specific lens that's doing the first line recruiting. So there is an inherent bias just because of who you are and affinity. And so that's one of the it is, while on one hand it is the truth, but it is a reason why organizations try to diversify the interview process. And it's just to ensure that they can have different and broader perspectives at the table, because that's just the reality of who's doing the frontline sourcing. But the larger myth, I will say, is that organizations are making an effort to try to streamline, if you want to call it discrimination and or biases, by putting forth processes leveraging technology to take away, ethnicities and certain names, and really have job postings that identify competencies, so that there is a level of movement towards fairness and that most people may or may not believe is so. So that's a couple of them. that I can share.
Okay, I think that's really helpful. And I guess before I was going to move on to, what are some of the challenges, but before I do, I guess one of the things I've seen is our firm, we work with employers and employees, and we work with employers of all sizes. It could be a multinational, it could be a mom and pop shop in rural Ontario. So when I have a discussion with, someone who's built up, and it's often a man because it's someone who built up a business starting 40 years ago, and he's now got 7 or 10 employees, whatever it is. And I mentioned diversity hiring, and I sort of either get a blank look or a very skeptical look. So how do you, when you're talking about these concepts with the really small business owners, how does the discussion change?
Different type of discussion. And so there's a reality. So 46% of our, in the US, again, I am talking US based, of our workforce are employed by small businesses. So when you look at the trajectory of small businesses, and, I'm one myself, you tend to hire your community and the folks within your sphere. And you're looking for, referral relationships. That's the majority of where they come from. And you're looking for those skills and confidence for people that you trust and that you can develop. And that's just the basic. So that's a reality. And so now you move in to say, hey, are you looking at diversifying your workforce? So, the blank stare is, well, I probably have, by gender and generational, and even if there are one person removed from it. So there's that. And it's okay that that's that way. But then you have your larger one where they have 100 or plus employees. They're still considered small businesses. Well, then I do have the intentional conversation of how you are sourcing your talent. And in today's environment where, remote, you can working remotely now is an option. Geography of now you can go everywhere globally to even hire people. Is talking to them about expanding their sphere, how they source for talent, and seriously consider diversifying their workforce. And it's a pretty positive. It's a hard shift, but it is a positive conversation, and it is a desire. And so, so step by step, because we have some of them that are our clients, step by step, they try to make some of these changes. Not as fast as corporate America in some cases, but they are leaning into understanding and try to do different sources.
Stuart, if I may.
I was about to ask if you want to jump in, so we're on the same page.
I do. Pam, I agree with you absolutely. What I'm seeing, I moved to Toronto from a city 2 hours west of Toronto about 20-something years ago now. The demographics of Toronto has changed from over 66% European descent to something about 42% European descent in Toronto now. So by the pure virtue of the demographics of this city, DEI is somewhat addressed. When I'm a small business owner, when any other small business or medium-sized business or any business puts a job opening out there, chances are you're going to get a good, vast, diverse application, of candidates that are hopefully qualified for this role. What we are seeing, and what you said also in your response there, was that we outsource a lot of our work outside of Canada. So we are into Turkey, we're in the Middle East, we're in other parts of Canada, parts of US. We're also in India as well. So just by the virtue of that, we're already increasing our diversity. And it's not necessarily in fact due to a DEI-centric program. It's basically the virtue of need and merit.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that. And then inherently, diversity happens to occur because you have a broader group of folks that are applying for, for these roles. And thank you for that feedback, because I think you do have global diversity, and then you have US centric. And US centric looks at, how many folks here that we can, have in our applicant pool that are based here. But then when they expand their recruiting options globally, particularly for global assignments, you're absolutely right. Rakesh, is that they don't even have to worry about the numbers because they inherently get a large group of applicants that are diverse. So I appreciate that.
The other perspective, Stuart, and then I'll stop after this, is what I was reading to prepare for this call was, it's interesting, small town businesses. So businesses based in a smaller town have less access to diverse pools of people, possibly, most likely. If they're more rural area. So you'll see a lot of manufacturing companies. Historically, IBM always went to a less metropolitan city so they could build bigger facilities. Okay, but these facilities are also in regions that are less diverse in every meaning of that word. So therefore, it's very difficult to manage a true DEI program in, Rochester, Minnesota. That's where an IBM plant is, for example. Historically, it's very tough to have a DEI program that works in a place like that because it is very homogeneous in its demographics, more or less. Right. So DEI is very interesting.
Well, there are your exceptions, but also, and I'm going to turn it back over to you, Stuart. But remember, there's 64 dimensions of DEI, and it's all not about ethnicity and gender, right? There's cognitive, there's cultural, there's education, there's all these other dimensions. So when you're and think about a monolithic culture. So if you're in an environment that doesn't allow ethnic diversity, there's so many other types of diversity that you can encourage. So I just want to say that, because that is a reality based on the geographies of our world.
That's great. And I love the fact that my guests are now doing research so they can ask questions. I'm going to be out of a job very soon. Did you say, Pam, 64 different points of diversity?
Yeah, there's 64 dimensions of diversity. So there's, and when most typically based on what Rakesh was talking about, cognitive diversity is one of the big ones in terms of organizations that say that have a predominantly white workforce, or an all white workforce, or an all Black workforce, or brown workforce. They're monolithic within their ethnicity. They look at and say, okay, we want the diversity of the background. We want the diversity of your experience. We want those dimensions where they can. But one of the realities, I will say, is, in a small rural town, in a manufacturing where you're going, you're not going to see it as much. So I think it's, those are family and those are culturally driven. And I don't have solutions for that. I just say those are realities of our world.
Yeah.
So
I think it's fair to say that one size does not fit all. So, your
Absolutely.
DEI recruiting in the Greater Toronto area is going to be very different than in rural, Northern Ontario.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Rakesh, you're going to add something.
Yeah, I was just got the cognitive comment that Pam made. It's really interesting. So Supreme Court of US had a ruling, I think it was last year, where race cannot be a definitive factor for academic approval or enrollment in universities and colleges in the States, specifically. But it still happens. So, for example, I have a family member, and they were applying to colleges in the States, and they hired, which is very common in the States, not common here, they hired a third-party consultant to help them get into some echelon of schooling that they want to get into. And they were told to make sure that they do not mention or align themselves at all to being Indian descent, even though they're Canadian born or American born, because it actually is a detractor to get into colleges and universities in certain programs because there's too many Indians there because of academic performance, right? So it was almost reverse discrimination based on the fact that Indians do really well academically, by these colleges. So DEI is a reverse, how do you DEI that?
That's not DEI. So, and we
no, it's negative. That's the opposite of DEI.
We talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, what that means. But to respond to what the Supreme Court decision did, that was really driven for state universities and what they were having at the onset for underrepresented groups. Schools were just giving them a fair opportunity to compete. And that's all race was doing. And it's a very, very small number of African Americans and Hispanics and lower income Asians and Indians were qualifying. But when Oregon, but in the admissions office, to your point about Indians and Asians too, in certain engineering programs, schools just feel that they are depleted with those groups. They make those decisions. Those it has nothing to do with anything than what the school admissions practices are doing. And whether you're Indian or not, whether you claim it or not, I have to push back against that because I have sat in many forums with admissions directors, and it's their policies and practices. Now, do I think that's fair? Not so much, but the reality is, they have their quotas, and that is real. They have their quotas, and they make decisions based on that, regardless of qualification and or ethnicity.
Yeah. I think Rakesh, brought up one of the challenges that I often get when I talk about DEI is that it's, some people see it as reverse discrimination. That's often the term that some people use. So, Pam, I guess how do you respond to that when people say, well, why should we be discriminating against one group in favor of another?
Well, we're not really discriminating against one group. We're providing access to groups that never had it before so that it's a level competitive playing field for everyone. And the reality is, in most places, Europe as well as the US, is that people of color do not have competitive access to the more I guess I want to say, I don't want to say prestigious, but even some of the state universities, they don't have access. And inherently, institutional racism has prevented it from. Mm-hmm. And so does it feel like reverse discrimination because you are among the 90% that you're competing against, and you may or may not get in because they have 10% allotted for another group that is equally qualified, but they want to diversify? I will just share with them, this is what it looks like. This is how it's looked like. This is what privilege and access has done for you. And this is what organizations and businesses are trying to do to level the playing field. And but I can't say it doesn't feel like you're not being discriminated against. It's not, you're just competing.
Well, I think you said something really important there. Sorry, Rakesh, I'll go and I'll let you go.
Yeah,
but you said something very important there because you referred to giving everyone an opportunity to compete, but you also referred to people being equally qualified. And I think that's the other often underlying sentiment that I hear, which is essentially we're being told we have to hire an inferior candidate because they are of a certain background. And I see you're shaking your head as I suspected you would, but I think that's something that really needs to be clarified.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So typically, I will tell you, most of the time they're overqualified for the positions, and everyone, I will say everyone, are equally qualified or more qualified for any role that they go for. And it does become discrimination if you do hire someone that's less qualified. Anyone and everyone on that panel, but now, I can't say that it hasn't happened. I cannot say people might have misinterpreted affirmative action or any other kinds of practices to say, I'm going to give X, female person or person of color this opportunity. And I wish they had this skill or that skill, but I can have them develop that on the job versus the person that has. I can't take away the personal discretion that may happen because I don't know that does not happen. So that could happen. But typically, the law, there's no quotas in terms of for hiring. Companies do not have that. All they're asking is to have a diverse slate so people can have choices, all qualified personnel.
Rakesh, you're going to jump in.
Yeah, I was, because as soon as you have a quota system, qualification alone is not the factor. Merit alone is not the factor.
Yeah, but
so the schooling systems in the US have a quota system.
No,
in India, they have quota system. I just gave you an example. They do.
No, you're talking about government funded set aside programs. That's quota. Corporate workplace hiring, they do not have quota.
I'm not talking. I didn't say corporate. I said academic schools.
Okay.
So some
DEI is not. So therefore,
Some.
there's an imbalance in society. If corporate is given a one mandate of how they need to hire and recruit, and academics are given a different mandate and requirement for hiring, there's an imbalance in society then.
So if you look at private,
if we're going to allow me to finish my argument, please.
Yes,
if you're going to have a DEI policy in a country, then it needs to be universal. India has the same problem in government and education. There's quotas. In corporate, there's no DEI legislation, and there's an imbalance that's occurring because of this. Okay, meaning the best people aren't getting educated. The best people aren't necessarily available for jobs. There is a problem. So what does access mean then? I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I agree with you with that. So after affirmative action legislation was no longer required, diversity, equity, and inclusion evolved over time, over decades. But diversity itself, companies took it on as a social responsibility and a corporate responsibility overall within America's workplace, that we want to hire, groups in our population that represent the consumer base. And so there never has been, to your point, you're absolutely right, legislation or any ruling that says this is what it is. Every company within their own culture could define what diversity means to them. And then equity, inclusion, so on and so forth. As many organizations all don't have DEI. They have diversity and inclusion. They have diversity, they have inclusion, they have belonging. So you're absolutely right. So because of that, there is the interpretation that folks make based on their own cultural experiences. So that I agree with. But to sit there and call quotas when you want to level the playing field of workplaces, academics that are predominantly given access to the majority groups, there's no other way to do it but to allow for the opportunity to create openings for others to compete, to have access.
In Canada, I have worked with several Indigenous groups in the past, and many organizations, whether government or corporate or otherwise, have attempted to say, we'll have a quota, or there's some sort of government funding or whatnot to support the hiring of Indigenous individuals within an organization. And I've worked on both sides with Indigenous groups as well as the non-Indigenous groups. And biggest challenge was finding enough people who were qualified for the role. So those quotas, call them quotas for a second, those thresholds historically have not been always achieved, in every profession because of the lack of, so for me, I would love to hire all types.
Yeah.
Let's put the money in education. Let's make education free in Canada and US. Let's educate our people. And then DEI becomes out the door because now it's merit-based. The best people are trained equally. I don't care.
Yeah. I go there with you. And I agree with everything that you just stated. Absolutely. That's absolutely part of the challenge. Mm-hmm.
So one of the responses I often get when I talk to employers about the need to take DEI into account when hiring, one of the responses I often get is, well, we just hire the best people. So Pam, how do you respond to that?
Not all the time.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but I guess to expand on it a little bit, often I get the answer that, well, I'm colorblind. I don't care about color, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, whatever. I just want the best person for the job.
So fundamentally, right, intrinsically, we hope that is the case, and we want them to do that. I mean, and to just respond to briefly what Rakesh said, the talent pipeline in certain industries, it does not exist. And it is upon companies to invest in those communities to develop, the talent of, you want to call them Indigenous group or underrepresented groups, and organizations are doing that. They are investing in historically Black colleges, historically is predominantly Hispanic, predominantly Asian, and tribal Indian education platforms. So they are doing that more than they have before. But it is a real issue of available talent when they want to meet a threshold of diversity. So they believe, and I believe this, I think people in hiring believe they're trying to hire the best talent. but we recognize that there are inherent biases just based on your experiences that, you can't do anything about that's going to lean you towards that, even after maybe the applications, AI will bring in the clean applications, but after you start talking to them, you do go to that personal culture fit. We try to get away from fit and all that, but the reality is that human element comes into place. And I do believe people want to do that. I do believe they believe that. And they do hire. I do believe they do hire the best talent, but it might not be the best talent to diversify the workforce. Go ahead. Yes, Rakesh.
So,
Rakesh, I recognize your hand being up, so go ahead.
I'm trying to be polite. Pam, 100%. I'm going to add to what you just said. The other thing that I'm seeing, my kids are at university stage of their life, and I'm seeing this at certain industries, law. Stuart, you're a lawyer with a law firm, your own law firm. What I'm seeing is that certain professions have bias towards certain academic institutions. So in the US for law, it might be Harvard or Columbia or some other beautiful school. In Canada, it might be Osgood or some other beautiful law school. I'm not quoting anybody. Engineering, it could be Waterloo. For commerce, it could be Queens and Western. So there's biases. Now the question is, if you look at any of these schools, are they fully diverse? May or may not. May or may not be. So if my bias is a certain academic institution, I'm already driving that inequality. You know what I mean? Like it's such a big topic.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. It's so systemic and it's so a part of who we are and how we do things. It's not going to change that quickly. And when you have some things in place to help it, and then you have SCROTUS, like our Supreme Court decisions that take us back, that just hurts us more. But I think the other thing it does, it requires us to re-examine, what we are and where we're doing. And I will tell you, and I hate to say this, but I have to agree with you, the legal.
You hate to agree with me?
No, I hate to agree with you on this, on the legal, with the lawyers, right? I don't want to really go there, but it is true. It's sadly but true that the legal industry has not changed. I mean, they haven't changed even on gender equity, but that's a whole nother conversation. And so some industries are hard. And some of my partners, some of my top 100 Fortune 100 companies in certain divisions say, oh no, we're still recruiting only from the top 10.
One last point, Stuart. Real quick.
We're quickly running out of time, so we got to make it a quick one.
So there's another argument out there that's saying, and I don't actually agree with this 80% of the way, so I disagree, is that productivity in Western countries have been stifled because of DEI and ESG incentives or intentions, where countries that do not have those focuses are actually becoming more productive and more successful in the growth of their countries rather, GDP and whatnot. So that's another interesting thing. And that's, if you look at US right now with the latest president, a lot of these climate change and DEI initiatives are being stifled, minimized, or eliminated because they feel that's a negative towards productivity of the country. It's counterintuitive. It's opposite of DEI, but it is happening.
Yeah, right? It's not true though.
It may or may not be true, but it is happening. It is happening.
Well, it's happening, but it's not true.
I'll jump in just because, as I promised, time flies by. And before I take my turn to fire away, Pam, I know your book, it says that you offer actionable advice on addressing diversity gaps and nurturing diverse recruiting teams. Could you offer a couple of quick tips on how people can do that?
Yeah, I actually would say please leverage technology, particularly if you're in an area that you do not have access to go and recruit different places. You have the ability now through virtual environments to actually go to virtual career fairs and identify talent. Also, to be able to go to different geographies and look at your workforce and the kind of scope of work that you have and where you can leverage remote opportunities. Also, not just rehiring, not just hiring people to come in, but look at all the benefits that you offer and share those as a retention tool, but also as a hiring tool. We have a 4-day work week. We offer, 3-week vacations. Attract talent based on the things that provide retention. And then define, not so much look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, but what are your core values and the principal beliefs that your company was founded on? Leverage those kinds of attributes to let people know that you are best place to work.
Cool. Thank you. That was really helpful, really insightful. Before I take my chance to fire away, how can people reach you if they want to discuss with you further?
Yeah, actually, my email directly is pam@diversitymba.magazine.com or our website, diversitymba.magazine.com.
Cool. And people should check out your podcast as well, which I did and thoroughly enjoyed. So thank you again. And Rakesh, if you want to reach out to find you, what's the best way?
LinkedIn works, as well as my email, rtiku@infieldssolutionsinc.com. Our website's infieldssolutionsinc.com. And thank you again, Stuart and Pam. It's been delightful.
Thank you both. And now I'll take my turn to fire away. So the message I want to convey this time is very simple. I want people to stop checking boxes and actually take the time to think. So in season 7, episode 12 of Fire Away, we talked a lot about DEI and diversity and inclusion. So whether it's talking about issues like that or employment contracts or harassment policies, a lot of business owners and a lot of business leaders approach them like tasks to be checked off their to-do list and never thought of again. When we advise organizations to use employment contracts, we don't mean just use any contract. When the government mandates harassment policies, they certainly require some things, but they don't prevent you from customizing those policies to your needs. Point is, there's no one size that fits all for any of these exercises, but we see this all the time. The business owner is told they should use an employment contract, so they go online and download one, or they find the one they signed 15 years ago and change the name of the company and check off the box and it's done. Or, and of course it's completely ineffective. And years later, when it's too late, their lawyer will explain to them that the contract isn't worth the paper it's printed on, and they're going on the hook for years of severance as opposed to weeks or months. Or they're told to incorporate DEI into their HR. So they find some cookie cutter solution, they check off the box. They fail to realize that they can and should implement a system that is customized to and benefits the company. So we've said this many times, employment laws are designed to protect employees, but there are lots of ways that employers can strengthen their position. Things like DEI requirements might sound like a burden, but they can be an opportunity if you put a little effort into it. To remember that all these things are living documents. You can't it's not just a one and done. You got to keep modifying, but you also got to adopt a strategic approach. Don't just do the minimum and check the box. Actually take the time to think about how this contract, this policy, this program can allow you to be compliant, but also strategic. That's all for now. That's a wrap for today's episode and also a wrap for season 7 of Fire Away. So our next episode is going to be out on February 18th, and I will have Sandra Beckor as my guest, joining me to talk about her Mindset Mastery program and exploring how that might impact things like HR and the employment law world. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I want to thank Pam and Rakesh again for being fantastic guests today and for a great conversation. Thank you to Rebecca, Rob, and Mark, as always, for production behind the scenes. And as my favorite hockey broadcaster always says, the pleasure was all ours.
At Rudner Law, we want people to treat their employment relationships as legal relationships and make informed decisions rather than assumptions. Keep up to date on Canadian employment law issues by following us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok, liking our Facebook page, subscribing to our YouTube channel, and signing up for our newsletter. Past episodes can be found on YouTube, on our website, and archived on Facebook. And if you like our page or subscribe to our channel, you will receive notifications when the episodes are live. As we always say, none of that replaces legal advice tailored to your specific circumstances. If you think you might need an employment lawyer, you probably do. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us.